Lonely rancher woke to find a stranger. Calling him husband in front of all, Samuel Hayes thought he'd buried love with his wife 3 years ago, until a stranger appeared on his porch, calling him husband in front of the whole town, speaking his name like she'd been whispering it in prayers for years. The morning sun found Samuel Hayes where it always did, alone on his weathered porch, coffee growing cold in his calloused hands. 3 years had passed since he'd buried Margaret beneath the cottonwood, and the silence had become his only companion. The ranch stretched before him like a prayer left unanswered, cattle moving slow as Sunday across land that once echoed with laughter. He was reaching for his hat when the wagon appeared on the horizon, dust trailing behind it like a question mark against the pale sky. Samuel squinted, shading his eyes. Visitors were rare as rain in August, and this one carried passengers, a woman and what looked to be a child. The wagon rolled to a stop before his gate, and the woman climbed down with careful movements, her blue dress dusty from travel. She was young, maybe 25, with hair the color of wheat before harvest, and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so tender in years. A boy of perhaps 6 stayed close to her side, his small hand gripping her skirt like it was all that kept him from falling. Samuel set his coffee on the porch rail and walked toward them, boots crunching on the dry earth. The woman looked up at him with an expression he couldn't read, hope mixed with something that might have been fear. "Mr. Hayes?" Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who'd practiced the words. "Samuel Hayes?" He nodded slowly, hat in his hands now. "That's right. Can I help you, ma'am?" She smiled then, and it transformed her face entirely. "I'm Mary," she said, as if the name should mean something to him. "Mary Whitfield. You're your bride." The words hit him like a physical blow. Samuel felt his mouth open, then close again. Behind him, he heard the creak of wagon wheels and turned to see neighbors gathering. Mrs. Patterson from the general store, old Tom Bradley, who ran the livery, even Pastor Williams emerging from his morning rounds. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake," Samuel managed, but Mary was already moving toward him, the boy still attached to her side. "No mistake," she said quietly, reaching into her traveling bag. She pulled out a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. "These are yours. Every one of them." Samuel stared at the letters, his name written across each envelope in his own familiar handwriting. But he'd never written any letters to any woman named Mary Whitfield. He'd barely written his own name since Margaret died, let alone courtship correspondence. "Mr. Hayes," Mary continued, her voice carrying clearly to the growing crowd. "You wrote to me about your ranch, about how the sunrise looks different when you have someone to share it with. You told me about your horses, Bell and Thunder, and how Thunder favors his left front hoof when the weather turns cold." Samuel's blood ran cold. Thunder did favor that hoof, but how could this stranger know such a thing? "You mentioned the cottonwood by your wife's grave," Mary went on, her eyes never leaving his face, "and how you talk to her sometimes when the wind moves through the branches just right." The crowd had grown larger. Samuel could feel their eyes on him, their whispered conversations buzzing like flies around honey. Mrs. Patterson was beaming, her hands clasped together as if witnessing a miracle. "You promised me a home," Mary said, her voice softer now, meant only for him. "You said you were tired of being alone, that this land needed the sound of children's laughter again." Samuel looked down at the boy, who stared back with solemn brown eyes. The child was thin, too thin, and there was something about the way he stayed so close to his mother that spoke of fear deeply rooted. Samuel began, but Mary stepped closer. "Please," she whispered, and in that single word he heard everything: desperation, hope, and a kind of exhaustion that came from running too long and too far. "Please don't turn us away." The crowd was watching, waiting. Pastor Williams stepped forward with a smile that could light up Sunday service. "Samuel, you old dog, keeping secrets from the whole congregation. When's the wedding?" Samuel felt trapped between the truth he knew and the fiction this woman had woven around them both. He looked at Mary again, really looked at her, and saw the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she held herself like someone expecting a blow. He started again, then stopped. The boy was watching him with those serious eyes, and Samuel realized the child hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived. "We've traveled so far," Mary said quietly. "From Kansas. The letters, they stopped coming, and I was so worried something had happened to you." Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together. "Oh, how romantic! A mail-order bride. Samuel Hayes, you sly fox." The weight of their expectation, their joy, pressed down on him like summer heat. Samuel looked at the letters in Mary's hands, at the way she held them like they were precious things, at the boy who stood so still and silent beside her. "Welcome to Texas," he heard himself say. The crowd erupted in congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Patterson was already planning a celebration, and Pastor Williams was talking about proper ceremonies. But Samuel only saw Mary's face, the way relief flooded her features like rain on drought-cracked earth. As the neighbors dispersed with promises to bring gifts and food, Samuel stood in the settling dust, wondering what he'd just agreed to. Mary was gathering their few belongings from a wagon, the boy helping with careful, practiced movements. "Thank you," she said quietly as she passed him, heading toward the house he'd kept empty as a tomb for 3 years. Samuel watched them disappear through his front door, mother and child carrying their secrets like shadows. The morning sun climbed higher, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his house held voices other than his own. He picked up his forgotten coffee, now stone cold, and wondered if sometimes the heart knew things the mind had yet to understand. For 3 days, Samuel played husband to a woman whose real name he didn't know, until he saw the bruises on her wrists and understood that sometimes a lie is the only thing standing between someone and their grave. 3 days passed like a careful dance between strangers. Mary moved through Samuel's house with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to make herself useful quickly. She swept floors that hadn't seen a woman's touch in years, hung curtains she'd sewn from fabric scraps, and filled the kitchen with smells that made Samuel's chest ache with memories he'd buried deep. The boy, Thomas, she'd told him, remained a shadow at his mother's side. He helped with small tasks, feeding the chickens and gathering eggs with movements too careful for a child his age. He never ran, never shouted, never did any of the wild, joyful things boys were meant to do. Instead, he watched everything with those serious brown eyes, as if the world were a dangerous place that required constant vigilance. Samuel found himself watching too. Watching the way Mary flinched when he moved too quickly. Watching how she always kept herself positioned between him and Thomas. Watching the graceful way she kneaded bread, her hands working the dough with a rhythm that spoke of years spent making something from nothing. On the second morning, Mrs. Patterson arrived with a basket of preserves and enough curiosity to fill a church. She settled herself at Samuel's kitchen table like she'd been invited for Sunday dinner. "Such a blessing," she declared, watching Mary pour coffee with steady hands. "This house has been too quiet for too long. And Thomas here," she smiled at the boy, who immediately stepped closer to his mother. "He'll be good company for the other children at Sunday service." Mary's hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. He's still getting used in new places. It might take him some time to warm up to other children." "Of course, dear. Children need time to settle." Mrs. Patterson's eyes took in every detail of the scene. The way Mary stood just out of arm's reach from Samuel, the boy's constant vigilance, the careful politeness that felt rehearsed. "You know, I don't recall Samuel ever mentioning his correspondence with Kansas. How long have you two been writing?" Samuel felt the question like a trap closing. He opened his mouth, but Mary answered first. "Nearly 2 years," she said smoothly. He's a private man. I imagine he wouldn't have mentioned it until he was certain." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "That sounds like our Samuel. Always thinking things through." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "And the wedding? When should we start planning?" The silence stretched too long. Samuel saw Mary's knuckles go white where she gripped the back of a chair. "Soon," he said finally. "We're still getting acquainted." After Mrs. Patterson left with promises to spread the happy news, Samuel found Mary sitting on the back porch steps, watching Thomas scatter corn for the chickens. Her sleeves were rolled up against the afternoon heat, and for the first time, Samuel saw them clearly, the bruises circling her wrists like dark bracelets. He sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them. "Mary." She looked up, startled, and quickly pulled her sleeves down. "Yes, those letters you showed me. The ones with my handwriting." Her body went very still. "What about them? I didn't write them." For a long moment, the only sounds were Thomas talking softly to the chickens and the distant lowing of cattle. Mary stared at her hands, and Samuel watched a single tear fall onto her blue dress. "I know," she whispered. "Then why?" "Because I was desperate." The words came out broken, barely audible. "Because Thomas and I had nowhere else to go, and your name was mentioned by a woman in Dodge City who said you were kind. She said you'd lost your wife and lived alone, and that you were the sort of man who wouldn't turn away someone in need." Samuel felt something shift in his chest, like ice beginning to crack. "What are you running from?" Mary was quiet, so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice hollow as winter wind. "My husband. My real husband. He's not a man who accepts when someone tries to leave." She showed him then, rolling up her sleeves completely. The bruises were old and new, layered like stories written in purple and yellow across her skin. There were others too, a faded mark on her throat, the careful way she held her left side. "Thomas hasn't spoken since." She stopped, glancing at her son. "Since the last time his father came home drinking. That was 6 months ago. We left the next morning." Samuel watched Thomas, who was sitting now with a chicken in his lap, stroking its feathers with infinite gentleness. "How long were you married?" 7 years. I was 17 when I met him. He was charming then. Or maybe I was just young enough to mistake fear for excitement." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "By the time I understood what he really was, Thomas was born, and leaving seemed impossible." "What changed?" Mary's hand went instinctively to her throat. "He started looking at Thomas the same way he looked at me. That's when I knew we had to run, no matter the cost." The weight of it settled over Samuel like dust after a windstorm. This woman and child weren't just homeless, they were hunted. And he'd somehow become their sanctuary, based on nothing more than a stranger's recommendation and Mary's desperate gamble with forged letters. "The neighbors," he said quietly. "They're expecting a wedding." "I know, and I know I have no right to ask you to keep up this pretense." "If you want us to leave?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than he intended. Mary looked at him with surprise, and Samuel realized he meant it completely. "You're not leaving. Not if you don't want to." That evening, as Mary tucked Thomas in a bed in the spare room that had once held Samuel's hope for children of his own, Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching the last light fade from the sky. The house felt different now, fuller, warmer, alive in ways he'd forgotten were possible. When Mary came downstairs, she found him still standing there. "Samuel," she said quietly, "why are you doing this? You don't know us. We could be anyone." He turned to face her, this woman who'd stumbled into his life carrying secrets and sorrow. "Because," he said simply, "sometimes the truth isn't the most important thing. Sometimes what matters is what's right." Mary's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "What if they find us? What if he comes looking?" Samuel thought of Thomas's silence, of the way the boy jumped at sudden sounds. He thought of Mary's careful movements, her practiced efficiency at making herself useful. He thought of the empty years since Margaret's death, and how this house had felt like a tomb until 3 days ago. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," he said. "But until then, you're Mary Hayes, and Thomas is my stepson, and this is your home." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood by Margaret's grave, and Samuel wondered if the dead could approve of the living's choices. He hoped they could, because for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had something worth protecting again. Samuel thought he was just protecting a woman and child, until 3 riders appeared asking questions about his wife, and he realized some men would rather see the world burn than let go of what they think they own. The riders came on the 7th day, when a morning mist still clung to the grass like secrets reluctant to be told. Samuel was in the barn, checking Thunder's hoof when he heard the hoofbeats. 3 horses, moving at the steady pace of men who weren't in a hurry because they knew they'd find what they were looking for eventually. He straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that hung on the barn wall. Through the open door, he watched them approach. 3 men wearing the dust of long travel and the hard expressions of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. The leader rode a black stallion that matched his disposition, his hat pulled low over eyes that surveyed the ranch like a man taking inventory. Samuel stepped out of the barn, rifle loose in his hands, but ready. Behind him, he heard the soft creak of the kitchen door and knew Mary was watching from the window. "Morning," the leader called out, reining in his horse 20 feet away. His voice carried the rough edge of whiskey and violence. "Name's Frank Brennan. These are my associates, Jack and Clem." Samuel nodded, but said nothing. In his experience, men who introduced themselves with their full names and mentioned associates were usually looking for trouble. "Fine spread you got here," Brennan continued, his eyes taking in the house, the barn, the cattle dotting the pasture. "Been here long." "Long enough." Samuel's grip tightened slightly on the rifle. "Something I can help you gentlemen with?" Brennan smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged on a coyote circling wounded prey. "Matter of fact, there is. We're looking for someone. A woman and her boy. They might be traveling together, might have taken up with someone new." Samuel's blood went cold, but he kept his expression neutral. "A lot of folks pass through. What makes you think they'd be here?" "Trail goes cold about 10 miles back," said the one called Jack. He was younger than the others, with the eager cruelty of someone still proving himself. "Asked in town about strangers, and your name came up. Seems you recently acquired a wife." "Congratulations," Brennan added, that dangerous smile never wavering. "Real romantic story, from what we heard. Mail-order bride from Kansas. Must be nice, finding love in your golden years." Samuel felt the insult like a slap, but didn't react. These men were fishing, seeing what they could pull up with their bait. "My wife's got nothing to do with whoever you're looking for." "Maybe not," Brennan said, "but we'd like to be sure." "See, the woman we're tracking, she's got a particular look about her. Blonde hair, blue eyes, answers to the name Mary. And the boy, he's about 6, hasn't spoken a word since his daddy tried to teach him some manners." The casual cruelty in Brennan's voice made Samuel's trigger finger itch. Behind him, he heard the almost silent sound of the kitchen door closing. Mary had withdrawn, probably getting Thomas somewhere safe. "Like I said," Samuel repeated carefully, "my wife's got nothing to do with your business." Clem, who'd been silent until now, spat into the dust. "Awful protective of a woman you just met through the mail." Brennan held up a hand, silencing his companion. "Now, Clem, maybe Mr. Hayes here is just being cautious. Can't blame a man for that." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. "Thing is, the woman we're looking for, she's not exactly free to be anyone's wife. See, she's already got a husband, name of Daniel Whitfield, and he's been looking for her for months." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. "Whitfield hire you to find her." In a manner of speaking, Brennan's smile turned predatory. "Danny's my brother, and when someone steals from family, well, that makes it personal. The pieces fell into place like dominoes. Mary's real name was Mary Whitfield. The husband she'd fled wasn't some stranger. He was the brother of a man who looked like he'd kill for sport. Now," Brennan continued, "I'm thinking maybe you didn't know all this when you took up with this particular woman. Maybe you were just being charitable to a widow and her boy. If that's the case, no harm done. Just let us take them off your hands, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." Samuel met Brennan's eyes directly. "And if I told you I don't have any idea what you're talking about, then we have ourselves a problem." Brennan's hand moved to rest on the pistol at his hip. "See, I've got witnesses in town who saw a blonde woman with a boy claiming to be your bride. Now, either you're harboring stolen property, or you're lying to my face. Either way, that's going to require some correction." The kitchen door opened again, and Mary stepped onto the porch. Samuel wanted to shout at her to get back inside, but she walked toward them with her chin raised and her hands steady. "I'm Mary Hayes," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard. "And I don't know what these men want, but they have no business on our land." Brennan's eyes lit up like he'd struck gold. "Well, hello there, sister-in-law. You're looking well, considering you left my brother bleeding on his kitchen floor." Mary didn't flinch. "I left him breathing. That was more mercy than he ever showed me or my son." "That boy isn't just yours," Brennan snarled, his pleasant mask slipping. "Danny's got rights, and you stole what belongs to him." "Nothing belongs to him," Mary said, but Samuel heard the tremor in her voice now. "Not me, and certainly not Thomas." Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Mary and the mounted men. "I think you gentlemen need to move along." Brennan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Or what, old man? You gonna shoot all three of us? Maybe you could get one, but the other two would cut you down before you could work that bold action." "Maybe," Samuel admitted, "but the first shot would be yours, Frank, and I don't miss at this range." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Samuel could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill, but he held Brennan's stare without blinking. Finally, Brennan reined his horse back. "This isn't over. Danny's got the law on his side. A man's got rights to his own wife and child. We'll be back with papers. Make this all legal and proper." "You do that," Samuel said. "But until then, you're trespassing." As the three men rode away, Samuel didn't lower the rifle until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he turn to Mary, who stood pale but resolute on the porch. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Not long," she whispered. "Frank always was smarter than Daniel. He'll figure out a way to make this legal, or he'll decide legal doesn't matter." That night, Samuel sat beside Margaret's grave under a canopy of stars that seemed dimmer than usual. The cottonwood whispered overhead, and he found himself talking to the headstone like he hadn't done in months. "I know you'd want me to do what's right, Maggie, but I'm not sure anymore what that is. Is it right to let them take her back to a man who beats her? Is it right to make Thomas watch his mother disappear into hell?" The wind stirred the leaves, and Samuel thought he heard an answer in the rustling. Or maybe it was just the sound of a man's conscience finally waking up after 3 years of sleep. When he returned to the house, he found Mary packing their few belongings by lamplight, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to disappear quickly. "Where will you go?" he asked. Mary looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "West, California, maybe somewhere far enough away that Frank won't follow." Samuel watched her fold Thomas's small shirt with careful hands, and something settled in his chest like a foundation stone finding its proper place. "No," he said quietly. Mary looked up, confused. "Samuel," I said no. He moved to the window, looking out at the land that had been his home for 15 years. "This is your home now. You're not running anymore. You don't understand what kind of men they are. I understand exactly what kind of men they are." Samuel turned back to her, and Mary saw something in his face that made her breath catch. "And I understand what kind of man I used to be before I let grief make me forget." In the lamplight, with the weight of decision settling around them like dust after a storm, Samuel Hayes began to remember who he was beneath 3 years of sorrow. And for the first time since the riders had appeared on his horizon, Mary Whitfield allowed herself to hope that running might finally be over. When Frank Brennan rode back with legal papers and loaded guns, Samuel Hayes had to choose. Let them drag Mary back to hell, or finally remember what it meant to fight for something worth saving. Dawn broke gray and cold, like the world itself was holding its breath. Samuel stood at his kitchen window, rifle cleaned and loaded, watching the horizon where he knew they'd come from. Behind him, Mary moved quietly, packing food and water in his saddlebags with the mechanical precision of someone preparing for war or flight. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, finally speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. His voice was barely a whisper, rusty with disuse. "Are the bad men coming back?" Mary's hands stilled on the leather straps. Samuel turned from the window, meeting the boy's solemn brown eyes. "Yes," Samuel said simply. He'd learned that children deserve truth, even when it was hard. "But they're not going to take you anywhere you don't want to go." Thomas nodded gravely, as if he'd expected nothing less from the world than more trouble. Will you shoot them? Only if I have to. My pa used to say shooting was the only thing that made sense to some people. The casual way Thomas spoke of violence, like it was weather or sunrise, made Samuel's chest tighten. No 6-year-old should know such things so well. Mary knelt beside her son, taking his small hands in hers. Thomas, whatever happens today, I need you to remember something. You're not your father. You are not his anger or his cruelty. You're something entirely your own, something good. The boy nodded solemnly, then looked at Samuel. Are you my pa now? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Samuel felt Mary's eyes on him, felt the weight of all the words they'd never spoken, all the promises they'd never made. If you want me to be, Samuel said quietly. Thomas considered this with the gravity of a judge. I think I do. You don't shout, and you don't hit, and you let me feed the chickens. Samuel smiled despite the fear coiling in his stomach. Well then, I reckon that makes us family. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. Samuel moved to the window again, counting riders. 5 this time. Frank and his 2 companions, plus 2 men wearing badges that glinted in the pale sunlight. They brought the law, Mary whispered, her face going white. Samuel studied the approaching group. The badges were real enough, but the men wearing them had the same hard look as Brennan's associates. Law bought and paid for, justice perverted into something ugly. Mary, Samuel said without turning from the window, take Thomas to the root cellar. Stay there until this is over. No. Her voice was steady, final. I won't hide anymore. If I'm going to be free, it has to start with not being afraid. Samuel wanted to argue, but he recognized the steel in her voice. It was the same tone Margaret had used when she'd insisted on helping deliver the Miller baby during that terrible blizzard, despite the risk. Some battles, he'd learned, couldn't be fought by hiding. The riders stopped at the gate, Frank Brennan sitting his black horse like a king surveying conquered territory. One of the badge-wearing men rode forward. Samuel Hayes? His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Deputy Marshal Crawford. I have a federal warrant for the return of Mary Whitfield and the child Thomas to their legal guardian, Daniel Whitfield of Dodge City, Kansas. Samuel stepped onto his porch, rifle held loosely but visibly. Marshal, with all due respect, the woman you're looking for is Mary Hayes. She's my wife. Crawford's laugh was harsh as winter wind. Mr. Hayes, bigamy is a federal crime. This woman is legally married to Daniel Whitfield, making any subsequent marriage null and void. Mary appeared at Samuel's side, Thomas's hand clutched in hers. I was never legally married to Daniel Whitfield. Ma'am, I have the certificate right here, signed under duress when I was 17 years old, after Daniel's friends made it clear what would happen to my family if I refused. Mary's voice carried across the yard with absolute clarity. That piece of paper was bought with threats, not consent. Frank Brennan spurred his horse closer. Enough talk. Danny wants his wife and boy back, and these gentlemen are here to make sure that happens legal-like. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between the mounted men and his family. And what if they don't want to go? The second deputy, younger and meaner-looking than Crawford, rested his hand on his pistol. What they want don't matter. Law's the law. Whose law? Samuel's voice carried a quiet authority that made several of the horses shift nervously. The law that says a man can beat his wife as long as he doesn't kill her? The law that says a child belongs to his father, even if that father is a monster? Crawford's face hardened. Mr. Hayes, you're interfering with federal officers in the execution of their duties. That's a crime that could see you hanged. Samuel felt something settle in his chest, cold and certain as winter ice. He'd spent 3 years running from the man he used to be, but that man was still there beneath the grief and guilt. That man had once worn a badge himself, had once stood between the innocent and those who had harmed them. Marshal, Samuel said quietly, I rode with the Texas Rangers for 8 years. I know what real law looks like, and this isn't it. The words hit like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of uncertainty through the group. Crawford's eyes narrowed. That's a bold claim, Hayes. Not a claim. A fact. Samuel's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. And as a former peace officer, I'm telling you that any court would throw out that marriage certificate the moment they heard how it was obtained. Which means you're not enforcing the law. You're helping kidnappers. Frank Brennan's patience finally snapped. Enough. He drew his pistol with the fluid motion of a man who'd done it many times before. We're taking them, and you can't stop us. Samuel's rifle came up smooth as silk, the barrel finding Brennan's chest with the inevitability of sunrise. Frank, you pull that trigger, and you'll be dead before you hit the ground. Your friends might get me after, but you won't see it happen. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, could smell the fierce sweat on the morning air, could feel Mary's presence behind him like warmth from a fire. Thomas stepped forward, moving past his mother to stand beside Samuel. His small voice carried clearly in the morning stillness. I don't want to go with you, he said, looking directly at Frank Brennan. My pa here doesn't hit us, and he lets us be happy. I want to stay with my real family. The simple words of a 6-year-old boy carried more power than all the federal warrants and legal papers in the world. Crawford looked uncomfortable, his hand moving away from his weapon. Kid's got a right to speak his mind, the marshal said slowly. He's 6 years old, Brennan snarled. He doesn't know what's good for him. He knows enough, Samuel said. The rifle never wavered. He knows the difference between love and fear. Seems to me that's all anyone needs to know. Mary stepped forward, her voice calm as prayer. Gentlemen, I'm not going back to Kansas. Not today, not ever. If you want to drag me away from here, you'll have to do it over the bodies of people who actually care whether I live or die. The weight of her words settled over the group like dust after a storm. Samuel saw doubt creeping into Crawford's face, saw the way the younger deputy kept looking between the badges on their chests, and the family standing united on the porch. Finally, Crawford holstered his weapon. Frank, this isn't what I signed up for. Fighting over custody is one thing, but this... He shook his head. This feels wrong. Brennan's face went purple with rage. You yellow-bellied. What I am, Crawford interrupted, is a man who knows the difference between law and vengeance. And what you're asking for isn't justice. One by one, the other men began backing their horses away. Even Brennan's companions seemed to lose their appetite for violence when faced with Samuel's steady rifle and the absolute certainty in his stance. Frank Brennan sat alone on his black horse, fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. This isn't over, Hayes. Danny's got rights, and he'll find another way to claim them. Samuel lowered his rifle slightly, but kept it ready. Tell Danny that if he wants to see his son, he can start by becoming the kind of man a boy could be proud to call father. Until then, Thomas stays where he's loved. Brennan spat into the dust, wheeled his horse around, and rode away with his dignity in tatters. The others followed, Crawford touching his hat brim in something that might have been respect. As the dust settled and silence reclaimed the morning, Samuel felt Mary's hand touch his shoulder. He turned to find her smiling, really smiling, for the first time since she'd arrived at his gate. Thank you, she whispered. Samuel looked down at Thomas, who was grinning up at him with the pure joy of a child who'd finally found safety. He looked at Mary, whose eyes held a lightness he hadn't seen before. He looked at his ranch, his land, his home that was no longer empty. No, he said quietly. Thank you both for reminding me what I was fighting for. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope, Thomas climbed into Samuel's lap with the easy trust of a son for his father. Pa, the boy said, will you teach me to take care of the horses? Samuel's arms tightened around the small body, feeling the fierce protectiveness that came with love freely given and received. Son, I'll teach you everything I know. Mary reached over and took Samuel's free hand, her fingers intertwining with his like they'd always belonged there. In the distance, a meadowlark called to its mate, and the sound carried across the prairie like a promise that tomorrow would be better than today. For the first time in 3 years, Samuel Hayes was no longer alone. And for the first time in her life, Mary Whitfield was exactly where she belonged, home.